Gripping a $900 diagnostic tablet, a young mechanic stared at 70-year-old cast iron like it owed him money. He laughed, warning a frail veteran to step back before getting hurt. 2 minutes later, that same old man made 30 tons of dead steel scream back to life. The air inside the restoration hangar tasted like pulverized rust and aerosol degreaser. It was a heavy, industrial sourness that coated the back of the throat. In the center of the concrete floor, suspended on a massive steel cradle, sat a Continental R975 radial engine. It was an ugly, brutal piece of machinery. 9 cylinders arranged in a massive circle, looking more like a mutated airplane motor than something meant to drive 30 tons of steel through the mud. Trent wiped a streak of black grease across his forehead, smearing it into his hairline. He was 28, lead mechanic at the shop, and currently losing a war against a machine built before his parents were born. "Crank it again," Trent snapped, his voice echoing off the corrugated tin roof. In the driver's seat of the partially assembled M4 Sherman hull a few yards away, Cody turned the heavy ignition switch. The electric starter engaged. It whined a high, desperate shrieking sound of metal teeth chewing against a flywheel. The massive engine gasped. A single cylinder fired with a deafening crack times, that sent a smoke ring of unburnt fuel spitting out of the exhaust manifold. Then, nothing. Just the hiss of compressed air leaking from an old gasket and the smell of raw, flooded gasoline. "Stop! Stop!" Trent slammed a gloved hand against the steel cradle. The impact jarred his wrist. "You're flooding it, you idiot." "I'm just turning the switch, man," Cody yelled back over the ringing in their ears. "It ain't catching." Trent pulled off his heavy rubber gloves and threw them onto a nearby workbench. They landed with a wet slap next to an expensive, rubber-armored diagnostic tablet. The screen glowed with digital manuals and PDF wiring diagrams. None of it was helping. Modern mechanics relied on sensors. They relied on error codes telling them exactly which oxygen sensor was failing or which fuel injector was clogged. This radial engine didn't have error codes. It had mechanical linkages, magnetos, and a carburetor the size of a toaster. It required intuition. It required a mechanic who understood how to feel the timing in their bones. Trent was a parts replacer, trained by computers. Sitting on a rusted folding chair in the shadow of a disassembled turret was Frank. Frank didn't say anything. He rarely did. His grandson dropped him off at the shop on Saturday mornings to get him out of the house, a favor to the shop owner who thought having an actual veteran around added some authentic flavor to the restoration business. Frank wore a faded corduroy jacket over a flannel shirt. He was 91 years old. His knuckles were swollen, arthritic knots that looked like burlwood, and his breathing was a shallow, whistling rhythm. He hated the smell of this place. The heavy scent of Cosmoline preservative and stale gasoline didn't bring back glorious memories of brotherhood or freedom. It brought back a bone-deep nausea. It brought back the phantom cold of the Chosin Reservoir in 1950, where the grease froze solid in the breeches of their weapons, and the engine blocks cracked if they weren't kept running. Frank watched Trent pace around the engine. He watched the young man poke at the wiring harness with a multimeter, checking for continuity where there was obviously plenty. The kid was looking at the spark plugs. It was the wrong place to look. "It's not the plugs," Frank mumbled. His voice was gravelly, barely louder than the hum of the shop's ventilation fans. Trent stopped. He turned slowly, the multimeter wires dangling from his hand like cheap plastic noodles. He looked at the old man sitting in the shadows. Trent's jaw tightened. He had been fighting this engine for 6 hours. The client, a tech millionaire who wanted a working Sherman tank for his sprawling Texas ranch, was coming for a demonstration on Tuesday. Trent was stressed. His pride was wounded, and he had exactly 0 patience left for the Human Museum exhibit in the corner. "What was that, Pops?" Trent asked, his tone dripping with a thin, brittle layer of forced politeness. "I said," Frank cleared his throat, the sound wet and rattling, "it ain't the plugs. You're getting fuel. You're getting spark. You're just getting them at the wrong time." Trent let out a short, sharp breath through his nose. He walked over to the workbench, picked up his tablet, and tapped the screen a few times, bringing up a complex schematic. "Look, Frank, I appreciate the input. I really do. But this isn't a lawnmower. It's a 9-cylinder, 400 horsepower aviation engine, adapted for ground use. We've got the fuel pressure regulated perfectly. The plugs are brand new iridium core. The battery bank is pushing exactly 24 volts. It's a resistance issue in the primary coil." Frank stared at him. The kid's words were a wall of meaningless technical jargon, meant to sound authoritative. It was the way people talked when they were terrified of looking stupid. "She's firing late," Frank said, leaning forward slightly. The canvas seat of the folding chair groaned. "Your magneto timing is retarded. The spark is chasing the piston down the cylinder instead of catching it at the top. That's why it backfired." Trent let out a harsh laugh. "Retarded timing. Right, okay." He tossed the tablet back onto the bench. "Listen, the magneto is bolted exactly where the manual says it should be. The hash marks are aligned. The computer says the timing is zeroed. So, unless the computer is lying to me, the timing is fine." The manual assumes the gear teeth inside haven't worn down for 70 years, Frank said. His voice didn't rise. It was flat, exhausted. "Hash marks don't mean a damn thing when the metal's chewed up." Trent crossed his arms. The tattooed turbocharger on his forearm distorted as his muscles flexed. "Tell you what, you want to wrench on this thing? Be my guest. But don't come crying to me when you blow out your back trying to lift a spanner." Cody, who had climbed out of the hull, snickered, wiping his hands on a shop towel. "Take it easy on him, Trent. He probably worked on horses before he worked on tanks." Frank didn't feel a surge of heroic adrenaline. He didn't feel anger. Not really. Anger required energy he hadn't possessed for a decade. What he felt was a dull, heavy irritation. He looked at the engine, the Continental R 975. He remembered the sharp metallic ping of sniper fire bouncing off the engine deck while he had been elbow-deep in a stalled radial, freezing rain turning his hands into useless blocks of wood. He remembered the smell of his own singed hair when a backfire had caught the edge of his parka. He didn't want to touch the machine. He wanted to go home, sit in his recliner, and eat a bowl of hot soup. But the engine was bleeding oil onto the floor, and the unburnt fuel stinging his eyes felt like a personal insult. It was a good machine. It didn't deserve to be abused by a kid who thought an iPad could fix 70 years of mechanical wear and tear. Frank placed his hands on his knees. He took a slow, rattling breath and pushed himself up. Frank's left knee popped loudly as he stood. The sound was sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of the shop. Cody winced slightly, but Trent just watched with a smirk as the old man began his slow shuffle across the concrete floor. Frank's boots scuffed the ground, stirring up a fine layer of gray dust. He felt fragile. His skin was parchment thin, speckled with purple age spots, and his spine possessed a permanent, rigid curve. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. Trent sighed, a loud, performative exhalation meant for Cody's benefit. "Frank, seriously, step back. This area isn't safe. There's bare voltage, and the fumes are thick. I don't need the liability of you tripping over an air hose." Frank ignored him. He reached the steel cradle. Up close, the engine was massive, a towering block of black iron and dull silver cooling fins. The heat, radiating off the one cylinder that had briefly fired, carried the sharp, unmistakable scent of rich combustion. It smelled like 1951. It smelled like wet dirt and exhaustion. Frank reached out and placed his bare hand against the cast iron valve cover of the top cylinder. "Hey, don't touch that. It's hot," Trent barked, taking a step forward. Frank didn't move his hand. The metal was warm, but not burning. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the subtle vibration of the metal settle into his palm. The engine was dead, but the heavy steel was still settling, ticking as it cooled. "You got a 3/4-inch box wrench?" Frank asked, opening his eyes and looking at the chaotic mess of gleaming tools scattered across the workbench. Trent let out a short, cynical bark of a laugh. "Are you deaf, old man?" I said back away. "I'm not playing games right now. The boss wants this thing running by Monday, and I have to track down a short in the harness." "There is no short," Frank said. He moved his hand from the valve cover down to the massive, round distributor cap of the magneto. "You've got a scintilla magneto here. Dual breaker points. You trusted the hash marks on the casing. You didn't account for the internal gear slop." Trent stepped right up to Frank. The mechanic was a foot taller and 100 pounds heavier. He smelled of fresh deodorant and stale energy drinks. "Listen to me, Grandpa. I went to technical school for 4 years. I've rebuilt Porsche engines. I've tuned high-performance diesels. Do not come into my bay and tell me how to read a timing mark." Frank looked up into Trent's face. He saw the flushed cheeks, the tight jaw. He recognized the look. It was the look of a lieutenant, fresh out of West Point, holding a map upside down and refusing to ask a sergeant for directions. "A Porsche ain't a tank," Frank said softly. "A Porsche is built to go fast. This is built to keep running when half its parts are full of mud and the other half are melted. It doesn't care about your computer. It cares about compression, fuel, and fire. And right now, your fire is late." Cody stepped closer, nervously shifting his weight. "Trent, man, just give him the wrench. What's the worst that happens? He turns a bolt, and we reset it." Trent glared at Cody, then back at Frank. He was trapped by his own arrogance. If he physically forced the old man away, he'd look like a bully. If he let him try, he risked looking like a fool if the old man broke something. But looking at Frank's shaking, liver-spotted hands, Trent's ego won out. He figured the old guy wouldn't even have the grip strength to break the locking nut loose. "Fine," Trent spat. He turned to the bench, snatched a heavy, chrome-plated, 3/4-inch wrench, and held it out. "Here, go nuts. But when you snap the mounting stud, you're paying for the extraction." Frank took the wrench. It felt incredibly heavy. The cold chrome bit into his stiff fingers. His grip was weak. He knew that. He couldn't muscle a torqued bolt anymore. But he didn't need to. He just needed leverage. "I need a flathead screwdriver," Frank said, not looking at Trent. "And a brass feeler gauge. 18 thousandths of an inch." Trent rolled his eyes so hard it was almost audible. He grabbed a screwdriver and a brass gauge from a top drawer and slapped them into Frank's waiting palm. 18 thousandths. Very specific. "You pulling numbers out of a hat? Or did a ghost tell you that?" Frank didn't answer. He turned his attention back to the massive iron beast, the Continental R, 975. He leaned heavily against the steel cradle, taking the weight off his bad knee. He brought the wrench up to the 2 heavy nuts, securing the magneto housing to the accessory drive on the back of the engine. The space was tight. It required sliding his arm between a hot exhaust pipe and a sharp piece of safety wire. His hand shook. The wrench slipped off the nut with a sharp, metallic clink. Trent chuckled from behind him. "Careful. Don't strain yourself." Frank closed his eyes again. He breathed in the smell of the aerosol degreaser, pushing it past his teeth. He ignored the ache in his shoulders. He let his mind drop back through the decades. He stopped thinking about the arthritis. He stopped thinking about the cocky kid behind him. He let his muscles remember the precise angle, the exact geometry of the machine that he had memorized in the freezing dark of a Korean winter. He slid the wrench back onto the nut. He didn't try to turn it with his wrist. He locked his elbow, leaned his fragile body weight against the handle, and used the mass of his own torso. There was a loud times, crack times, as the rusted locking nut broke free. Trent's smirk vanished. The shop went completely silent, save for the hum of the ventilation fan and the rattling, labored breath of a 91-year-old man getting to work. Frank didn't pause to celebrate the small victory of a loosened bolt. He couldn't afford to lose the momentum. He shifted his weight, his bad knee throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache that kept time with his elevated pulse, and brought the wrench to the second locking nut. He leaned into it. The nut snapped free. With the housing loose, Frank dropped the heavy chrome wrench. It hit the concrete floor with a sharp, ringing clatter that made Trent flinch. Frank didn't notice. He was already working the flathead screwdriver under the edge of the heavy, domed bakelite cap of the magneto. The cap popped off, exposing the intricate brass and steel guts of the distributor. The smell hit him instantly, a sharp, acrid waft of ozone and burnt carbon. It was the smell of high voltage struggling to jump a gap. Trent hovered just over Frank's right shoulder. "You're going to screw up the dwell angle," the younger man warned. His voice had lost a fraction of its sneer, replaced by a nervous, tight edge. "If you advance it too far, she'll kick back against the starter and shear the pinion gear." Frank didn't look at him. He stared down into the magneto housing. His eyesight wasn't what it used to be. The small components blurred at the edges, but he didn't need 20/20 vision. He reached in with his bare, grease-stained thumb and pressed it against the breaker points, the tiny tungsten contacts that opened and closed to trigger the spark. They felt rough, pitted. "Your computer tells you the housing is aligned," Frank muttered. His voice, a raspy whisper, meant more for the engine than for Trent. "But the fiber block on these points has been riding the cam for God knows how many hours. It wears down. When it wears down, the points open late. Late spark means raw gas in the manifold. Raw gas means a backfire." He slid the brass 18,000ths feeler gauge between the contacts. It slid through without any resistance. There was way too much gap. Frank wedged the flathead screwdriver into the adjustment slot. His hands were shaking worse now. The adrenaline of the physical exertion was fading, leaving behind the brittle reality of his age. The tip of the screwdriver slipped out of the slot twice, gouging the soft brass plate below it. He cursed under his breath. It wasn't a heroic movie star moment. It was frustrating. He felt his fragile mortality in the weakness of his wrists. He closed his eyes. "Stop looking at it," he told himself. "Feel it." He let his trembling left hand guide the steel shaft of the screwdriver, anchoring it. He pressed the tip into the slot. He wedged the brass gauge between the points again. With slow, deliberate pressure, he turned the screwdriver. He didn't look at a screen. He didn't read a dial. He waited for the exact, specific drag of the tungsten contacts biting into the thin sliver of brass. It was a sensation he had memorized in a motor pool in Busan, working blind in the rain because striking a match meant a sniper would put a hole in his neck. There, a slight friction. The brass gauge slid in and out with the resistance of a heavy zipper. Frank tightened the lockdown screw. He pulled the gauge out and wiped it on his flannel shirt. Then, He grabbed the entire heavy housing of the magneto with both hands. "What are you doing?" Trent demanded, stepping forward. Advancing the spark, Frank grunted. He twisted the housing a fraction of an inch counterclockwise against the rotation of the internal cam. He was deliberately throwing the hash marks out of alignment. He was intentionally contradicting the digital manual glowing on the tablet a few feet away. He picked up the wrench from the floor, his joints popping in protest, and locked the two mounting nuts down tight. The torque was purely by feel, tight enough to hold against vibration, loose enough not to snap the ancient studs. Frank stepped back. He wiped a streak of black grease and sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand, perfectly mirroring the smear Trent had given himself earlier. He felt lightheaded. His chest was tight, his lungs whistling a harsh tune in the quiet shop. He turned toward the hull of the tank. Cody was still sitting in the driver's seat, his head poking out of the hatch, watching the old man with wide, uncertain eyes. "Pump the primer 3 times, Frank said. His voice cracked, sounding weak and hollow. "No choke, just hit the switch." Cody looked at Trent. He was waiting for permission from his boss. Trent stared at the engine, then at Frank. The young mechanic's face was a map of conflicting emotions, wounded pride, deep skepticism, and a desperate, creeping hope that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare of this engine was over. Trent swallowed hard. "Do it," Trent said quietly. Cody disappeared into the dark steel cavern of the hull. A few seconds later, the high mechanical whine of the electric starter motor sliced through the stale air of the hangar. The massive flywheel engaged. The Continental R 975 groaned. It was a heavy, reluctant sound, like a sleeping giant being dragged out of the mud. Chuff, chuff, chuff. The cylinders were compressing. The engine was pulling fuel, drawing air, pushing it against the spark. Frank stood perfectly still. He didn't cross his fingers. He didn't pray. He just listened. He was listening to the rhythm of the internal mechanics, feeling the heavy vibration traveling through the concrete floor and into the soles of his boots. Suddenly, the top cylinder caught. Bang. It wasn't a backfire this time. It was a sharp, concussive detonation of perfectly timed combustion. Before the echo could bounce off the tin roof, the cylinder next to it fired, then the next. The radial engine erupted. The sound was absolute, violent chaos. It was deafening. 9 massive pistons hammering in a circular frenzy, churning out 400 horsepower of brute, unrefined violence. A thick cloud of blue-black smoke blew out of the open exhaust manifolds, smelling of burnt oil, hot iron, and absolute power. The heavy steel cradle shook violently, the bolts rattling against the concrete. The entire hangar vibrated. Dust that had sat on the overhead rafters for a decade rained down in a fine, gray mist. It didn't sound like a finely tuned machine. It sounded like a weapon. Trent stumbled back, throwing his arms up to shield his face from the blast of hot exhaust. His eyes were wide, his mouth hanging open in sheer shock. He looked at the engine, screaming and shaking on its stand, running smooth and heavy. The idle leveled out into a deep, guttural, rhythmic thumping that vibrated right in the center of the chest. Trent turned to look at Frank. The old man hadn't moved. He stood entirely swallowed by the gray smoke, his faded corduroy jacket flapping slightly in the wash of the cooling fan. He wasn't smiling. There was no triumphant fist pump. There was no gleam of heroic satisfaction in his watery eyes. Frank just looked incredibly, profoundly tired. The roar of the engine didn't sound like victory to him. It sounded like a convoy stalling on a frozen mountain pass. It sounded like the panicked screaming of a young loader who couldn't get the hatch open fast enough. The smell of the hot exhaust made his stomach churn with a phantom anxiety he hadn't felt in 60 years. He had fixed it because it was broken. That was all. Frank reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled, oil-stained rag, and slowly wiped his hands. He tossed the brass feeler gauge onto the workbench. It landed right on top of Trent's $900 diagnostic tablet. Cody killed the ignition. The heavy mechanical clatter wound down, the massive cylinders coming to a rest with a final, heavy hiss of compressed air. The silence that rushed back into the hangar was heavier than the noise had been. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic ticking of expanding iron. Trent slowly lowered his arms. He looked at the engine, then at the tablet, and finally at the fragile old man standing in the settling dust. Trent's arrogance had been completely burned away, leaving him looking very young and very out of his depth. He walked over to Frank. He opened his mouth, struggling to find the words. Apology, gratitude, an admission of defeat. Frank, Trent stammered. He rubbed the back of his neck, leaving another streak of grease on his skin. I don't even know how you... The computer said the timing was dead zero. How did you know? Frank looked at Trent. He saw past the tattoos and the ego. He just saw a kid who had never had to bet his life on a piece of metal. Computers tell you how things ought to be in a perfect world, Frank said quietly, pulling his coat tighter against the phantom chill in his bones. But machines don't live in a perfect world, son. They live in the dirt, just like us. They wear out. They get tired. You gotta learn to listen to what they're doing, not what the manual says they should be doing. Trent stared at him, absorbing the weight of the words. He slowly nodded. I appreciate it. Thank you. Frank didn't say, "You're welcome." He didn't offer a warm smile. He just gave a curt, tight nod. He turned his back on the machine, his boots dragging slightly on the concrete, and began the slow, painful shuffle back to his rusted folding chair in the shadows. He sat down heavily. The canvas groaned. He leaned his head back against the cold steel of the disassembled turret behind him and closed his eyes. "Hey, kid," Frank called out softly. Trent snapped to attention. "Yeah, Frank? What do you need? Water? You want me to get the boss?" "No," Frank sighed, letting the weariness pull him down into the chair. "Just tell my grandson to hurry up. I want to go home and eat my soup." If you felt the roar of that radial engine and the quiet strength of a generation that built things to last, don't let this story fade away. Hit that like button to show your respect for the veterans who know what true grit means. Share this with someone who appreciates the difference between a computer screen and real, hard-earned experience. And subscribe for more raw, grounded stories of the machines and the people who keep them alive.